Sometimes life breaks your heart in ways you never see coming, leaving you stranded in places you never meant to be. That's exactly what happened to Margaret Ellsworth when she stepped off the train in Dust Hollow, clutching her trunk and the shattered pieces of her dreams. The man she came to marry never showed up. Her ring meant nothing. She begged the station master for help, but he just shrugged. That's when cattle rancher Boone Rawlins saw her from across the platform. He'd lost his own wife years ago and knew that look of desperation. When he offered her shelter, she had no choice but to trust him. Over quiet evenings by the fire, she told him why she had to leave Boston and why she could never go back. What had Maggie fled from in Boston that made returning impossible? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the weathered platform of Dust Hollow Station, where the desert wind carried the scent of sage and the distant promise of rain. This wasn't a place where dreams came to flourish, it was where they came to die, slowly and quietly, like the town itself. Once a thriving railroad stop during the silver boom of the 70s, Dust Hollow now survived on stubbornness and the occasional cattle shipment heading east to markets that seemed as distant as the moon. Boone Rawlins had built his life in this harsh country, carving prosperity from land that others dismissed as worthless. At 53, he possessed the weathered strength of a man who'd learned early that the desert respected only those who respected it back. His cattle ranch, the Double R, sprawled across 15,000 acres of high desert plateau, where hardy longhorns grazed on bunch grass, and his reputation for fair dealing stretched as far as Phoenix. The leather reins felt familiar in his calloused hands as he guided his wagon toward the train station, a weekly ritual to collect supplies and the occasional piece of mail that connected him to the wider world. He hadn't expected to find a woman in traveling clothes, standing beside a worn leather trunk, her face etched with the kind of desperation that comes from having nowhere left to turn. Margaret Ellsworth stood 5'6", with auburn hair showing threads of silver at the temples and eyes the color of storm clouds. Her navy traveling dress, though wrinkled from the long journey, spoke of quality fabric and careful stitching. Everything about her suggested refinement, from the way she held her shoulders straight, despite her obvious distress, to the cultured accent that colored her pleas to the station master. "Please, there must be somewhere I can send a telegram," she was saying, her voice carrying the careful modulation of someone accustomed to being heard and heeded. "I have money for payment." Jake Morrison, the station master, scratched his graying beard and shook his head with the weary patience of a man who'd delivered bad news too many times. "Ma'am, like I told you, the telegraph line's been down for 3 weeks. Storm took out the poles between here and Tucson. Could be another month before they get around to fixing them." Boone watched from his wagon as Margaret's composure finally cracked. Her hand went to her throat, fingers worrying at something beneath the collar of her dresser gesture that spoke of nervous habits and barely contained panic. He'd seen that look before, during the war, in the eyes of soldiers who'd pushed themselves as far as they could go and suddenly realized there was no retreat. "Is there a hotel?" she asked, though from her tone she already suspected the answer. "Boarding house burned down last spring. Mrs. Chen runs a room above the general store, but she's visiting her sister in Tombstone for the month." Jake's expression softened slightly. "Ma'am, if you don't mind me asking, what brings you to Dust Hollow? Ain't exactly a destination most folks choose." Margaret's laugh held no humor. "I was supposed to meet someone here, a gentleman who promised." She stopped, pressing her lips together, as if the words tasted bitter. "It appears I was mistaken about his character." Boone had heard enough. He set the wagon brake and climbed down, his boots raising small clouds of dust as he approached. Jake nodded at him with relief. Very one. In Dust Hollow knew Boone Rawlins as a man who solved problems rather than created them. "Afternoon, Jake, ma'am." Boone touched the brim of his hat to Margaret, noting how she straightened at his approach, her chin lifting with what remained of her pride. "Couldn't help overhearing your situation. Name's Boone Rawlins. I run cattle about 10 miles north of here." Margaret studied his face with the careful assessment of someone who'd learned to read character quickly. She saw a tall man with broad shoulders and sun-weathered skin, dark hair showing silver at the temples beneath his well-worn hat. His clothes were practical cotton shirt, leather vest, denim pants that had seen honest work, but clean and well-maintained. Most importantly, she saw kindness in his brown eyes, tempered by the caution of someone who'd known loss. "Margaret Ellsworth," she replied, offering a slight curtsy that seemed automatic. "I find myself in rather reduced circumstances, Mr. Rawlins." "I can see that." Boone glanced at Jake, who was already retreating toward his office, with the relief of a man eager to avoid complications. "You got anywhere to go, Mrs. Ellsworth?" The title wasn't entirely accurate. Margaret had been widowed for 2 years, but she didn't correct him. "I'm afraid not. I was depending on arrangements that have proven unreliable." Something in her careful phrasing told Boone there was more to the story, but he'd learned that desert country taught a man to respect privacy. A person's past was their own business until they chose to share it. "Well, I've got a ranch house with more rooms than I use, and my cook quit last month to get married. If you're willing to earn your keep helping with meals and general housekeeping, you're welcome to stay until you figure out your next step." Margaret's eyes widened. In Boston society, such an arrangement would be scandalous, but Boston society felt as distant as another lifetime. Here, faced with the practical necessity of survival, propriety seemed like a luxury she could no longer afford. "I should warn you, Mr. Rawlins, I have very little money and no immediate prospects for acquiring more." "Didn't ask about your money." Boone's tone remained matter-of-fact. "Asked if you could cook and keep house, can you?" A ghost of a smile touched Margaret's lips. "I managed a household staff of 6 in Boston for 12 years. I believe I can handle cooking for 1 rancher." "Good enough." Boone moved toward her trunk, testing its weight before lifting it easily. "We'll get you settled, and you can decide what comes next after you've had a decent meal and a night's sleep." As they loaded her trunk into the wagon, Margaret felt the first stirring of hope she'd experienced in weeks. This gruff cowboy, with his straightforward manner, was offering exactly what she needed: most time and sanctuary. She didn't dare tell him how desperately she needed both, or why returning east wasn't an option no matter how dire her circumstances became. The ride to the Double R took them through country that seemed to stretch endlessly toward purple mountains on the horizon. Boone kept up a steady commentary about the land, pointing out landmarks, explaining the challenges of desert ranching, describing the seasonal rhythms that governed life in this harsh but beautiful country. His voice held the deep affection of a man who'd found his place in the world and made peace with its demands. "Been running cattle here for 15 years, he said as they crested a ridge that revealed his ranch spread out below them. "Started with nothing but determination and a belief that this country had more to offer than most folks gave it credit for." Margaret studied the scene before them with genuine admiration. The ranch house was built of adobe and timber, its wide porches offering shelter from both sun and rain. Corrals and outbuildings were arranged with practical efficiency, while the main house suggested comfort without ostentation. Gardens showed the careful attention of someone who understood that beauty required effort in this climate. "It's lovely," she said, and meant it. "You've built something substantial here." Boone's expression darkened slightly. "Built it with my wife, Sarah. She died 3 years ago, come September. Fever took her during a bad summer, when the doctor couldn't get through from Tucson. I'm sorry for your loss." Margaret's words carried the weight of genuine understanding. "I lost my husband 2 years ago. The loneliness is the hardest part, isn't it?" Their eyes met briefly, recognizing in each other the particular grief of those who'd expected to share their later years with someone who was no longer there. It was a moment of connection that neither had anticipated, and both looked away simultaneously, uncertain how to navigate this unexpected common ground. 2 men emerged from the barn as the wagon approached on, older with the weathered face and bow-legged gait of a lifelong horseman, the other younger with the eager energy of someone still learning his trade. Both wore the practical clothes of working cowboys, their hats pushed back as they studied the unexpected passenger with polite curiosity. "Miguel, Tommy, like you to meet Mrs. Ellsworth." Boone said as he helped Margaret down from the wagon. "She'll be helping out around the house for a while." Miguel Rodriguez had worked for Boone for 8 years and possessed the diplomatic skills that came from managing ranch hands and mediating between his boss's sometimes stubborn independence and the practical necessities of running a successful operation. He touched his hat brim respectfully. "Welcome to the Double R, Senora. If you need anything, you just ask." Tommy Carson, 19 and eager to please, fairly bounced on his toes. "Yes, ma'am. Real nice to have a lady around the place again. Gets pretty quiet out here with just us old cowhands for company." Margaret smiled at their obvious good nature. "Thank you both. I look forward to earning my place here." As Boone carried her trunk toward the house, Miguel fell into step beside him, speaking quietly in Spanish. Margaret caught enough words to understand he was expressing concern about the propriety of the arrangement, but Boone's response was firm though equally quiet. The interior of the ranch house surprised Margaret with its comfort and attention to detail. The main room featured a stone fireplace large enough to heat the entire space, with furniture that showed quality craftsmanship. Windows faced both east and west, capturing morning light and afternoon breezes. Everything was clean and well-maintained, though it carried the indefinable emptiness of a home where laughter had been absent too long. "Sarah did most of the decorating," Boone explained, noting Margaret's appraising glance. "I've kept things pretty much the way she left them." Margaret nodded, understanding immediately. The house was a shrine to a marriage that had ended too soon, preserved exactly as it had been when love and partnership had filled these rooms. She felt both honored and burdened by the trust implicit in being welcomed into this carefully maintained memorial. "The kitchen's through here," Boone continued, leading her into a spacious room equipped with a modern cast-iron stove and well-organized work surfaces. Sarah always said a good kitchen was the heart of any home worth having. She was right. Margaret ran her hand along the smooth wooden countertop, already envisioning the possibilities. "This is beautifully arranged." The bedroom Boone showed her was simply furnished but comfortable, with windows that looked out over the ranch's main operations. It had obviously been a guest room, carefully neutral and welcoming without being personal. Margaret set her trunk at the foot of the bed and turned to face her unexpected benefactor. "Mr. Rawlins, I want you to know how grateful I am for your kindness. I realize this arrangement is somewhat unconventional." Boone leaned against the doorframe, his expression thoughtful. "Ma'am, I've learned that life rarely follows the conventional path. Sometimes the best thing you can do is help someone when they need it, and trust that things will work out as they're meant to." After he left her to settle in, Margaret sat on the edge of the bed and allowed herself the first moment of true reflection she'd had since stepping off that train. The worn leather trunk beside her contained everything she owned in the world: clothes, a few books, some jewelry of sentimental value, and hidden beneath a false bottom, papers that could destroy lives and end her own if they fell into the wrong hands. She'd traveled over 2,000 miles to escape a past that threatened not just her own safety, but the welfare of 2 children she'd raised as her own. The man who'd promised to marry her and provide sanctuary had proven to be either a fraud or a coward. It hardly mattered which. What mattered was that she was alone again, dependent on the charity of a stranger whose own grief made him willing to shelter another lost soul. Outside her window, she could hear the everyday sounds of ranch life horses moving in the corral, men calling to each other as they finished the day's work, the distant lowing of cattle settling for the night. It was a peaceful sound, alien to someone accustomed to the constant noise of city life, but somehow comforting in its rhythm and predictability. Margaret rose and began unpacking her few belongings, carefully avoiding the hidden compartment that held her dangerous secrets. Tomorrow she would begin earning her place in this sanctuary, cooking and cleaning for a man whose kindness had given her hope when she'd thought it was lost forever. She couldn't tell him the truth about why she'd fled Boston, couldn't risk involving him in the deadly game that had already cost her everything she'd held dear. But tonight, for the first time in months, she could sleep without fear of being discovered. Tonight, She was safe under the protection of a man who asked no questions and expected nothing but honest work in return for shelter. It was more than she'd dared hope for, and perhaps, if she was very careful and very lucky, it might be enough. Margaret's first night at the Double R brought dreams that left her gasping awake in the pre-dawn darkness, her nightgown damp with perspiration despite the desert's cool night air. In her dreams, she was running through the narrow streets of Boston's Back Bay, clutching the hands of two frightened children while shadowy figures pursued them through gaslit alleys that seemed to stretch endlessly ahead. She sat up in the unfamiliar bed, pressing her palms against her temples as the nightmare's grip slowly loosened. Through the window, she could see the first pale hint of sunrise touching the mountains, and somewhere in the distance, a rooster crowed with determined optimism. The mundane sounds of morning helped ground her. In reality, she was safe, at least for now, in a place where her past couldn't reach her. By the time Boone emerged from his room, Margaret had already started coffee and was examining the contents of his pantry with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to creating meals from available ingredients. She wore a simple grey dress with her hair pinned back efficiently, and if he noticed the faint shadows under her eyes, he was too polite to comment. "Morning," he said, accepting the cup of coffee she offered with genuine gratitude. "You're up early." "I've always been an early riser." Margaret turned back to the stove, where bacon was already sizzling in an iron skillet. "I hope you don't mind I took the liberty of starting breakfast." "Mind? Ma'am, I haven't had a proper breakfast in months. Miguel does his best, but his talents lie more with horses than cooking." They ate in comfortable silence, both still adjusting to the presence of another person at the table. Margaret had forgotten how pleasant it could be to share a morning meal with someone, while Boone found himself noticing details he'd overlooked for years: the way sunlight slanted through the kitchen windows, the satisfaction of food prepared with care rather than mere necessity. After breakfast, Margaret insisted on cleaning the dishes while Boone prepared for his daily rounds of the ranch. She watched from the kitchen window as he saddled his horse and rode out with Miguel and Tommy, their easy camaraderie speaking of years of shared work and mutual respect. For a moment, she envied their uncomplicated lives, their ability to face each day without looking over their shoulders. With the men gone, Margaret began a thorough exploration of the house, taking inventory of what needed attention. Sarah Rawlins had been an excellent housekeeper, but 3 years of bachelor living had left their mark. Dust had accumulated on surfaces that had once gleamed, curtains needed washing, and several rooms showed the neglect of a man who found housework an unwelcome reminder of his loss. She started with the main room, carefully moving Sarah's photographs and mementos to dust the surfaces beneath them. Each item told part of the story: a young couple's wedding portrait, showing Boone with fewer lines around his eyes, and Sarah with the bright confidence of a woman embarking on life's great adventure. Another photograph showed the couple standing before the half-built ranch house, Sarah's hand resting on her husband's arm with proprietary pride. Margaret found herself studying Sarah's face, wondering what kind of woman had captured Boone's heart so completely that he'd chosen to live alone rather than risk loving someone else. She'd been pretty in the way of women who are loved, well, not a classical beauty, but someone whose happiness made her radiant. Her death had clearly devastated Boone, leaving him suspended between honoring her memory and moving forward with his own life. By mid-afternoon, Margaret had worked her way through most of the house, and the physical activity had helped quiet the anxiety that perpetually hummed beneath her composed surface. She was hanging freshly washed curtains in the parlor when she heard the sound of papers rustling in the slight breeze that moved through the open windows. Her trunk sat where Boone had placed it that morning, its lid slightly ajar from her hasty unpacking. A corner of white paper was visible, and Margaret's heart stopped as she realized what it was, of the letters that should have been safely hidden in the trunk's false bottom. She rushed to the trunk, her hands shaking as she examined the hidden compartment. The catch had worked loose during the journey, allowing several papers to slip into the main compartment where they could be easily discovered. With trembling fingers, she gathered the scattered documents, quickly scanning their contents to assess the damage. Most were still sealed in their original envelopes, but one had torn open, revealing fragments of text that would be damning if read by the wrong person. The children are safe for now, but Blackwood's men are asking questions, and you must never return to Boston. If they find you, we're all lost. Margaret sank onto the bedroom floor, clutching the papers to her chest as the weight of her situation crashed over her again. She'd been a fool to think she could simply disappear, that the powerful men who wanted her dead would give up their pursuit. The torn letter was proof that even here, in this remote sanctuary, she wasn't truly safe. She was so absorbed in her panic that she didn't hear Boone's return until his voice spoke from the doorway. "Mrs. Ellsworth, is everything all right?" Margaret spun around, instinctively trying to hide the papers behind her back, but it was too late. Boone's sharp eyes had already taken in the scene: the open trunk, the scattered documents, and her obvious distress. "I'm sorry," she stammered, rising to her feet on unsteady legs. "I was just these papers. They're private correspondence, and I—" Boone stepped into the room, his expression grave. He'd seen enough of fear to recognize it when it stood before him, and whatever was in those papers had Margaret Ellsworth terrified. "Ma'am, I need you to know that whatever brought you to Dust Hollow, whatever you're running from, you're safe here. But if there's something I should know about, something that might put my men in danger, I'd appreciate the truth." Margaret's composure finally shattered. The weeks of constant fear, the exhaustion of always looking over her shoulder, the weight of protecting secrets that could destroy innocent people at all, came pouring out in great, shuddering sobs that shook her entire body. Boone moved toward her carefully, the way he might approach a wounded animal. "Easy now. Whatever it is, we'll figure it out." "You don't understand," Margaret gasped between sobs. "I'm not just a woman whose marriage plans fell through. I'm not even really Margaret Ellsworth. Well, I am. But that's not why I'm here. I'm running from men who want me dead, and by helping me, you've put yourself in terrible danger." She sank onto the bed, still clutching the papers, and looked up at him with eyes full of desperate honesty. "My husband, me late husband, he wasn't just a businessman in Boston. He was involved with people, dangerous people, and when he died, they came for me. They want something I have, information that could destroy them, and they'll kill anyone who gets in their way." Boone sat down beside her, maintaining a careful distance but close enough to offer comfort. "These dangerous people, they followed you here?" "I don't know. I thought I'd covered my tracks, but—" She held up the torn letter. "This mentions Boston, mentions threats. If someone found it, if they put the pieces together—" "Let me see it." Margaret hesitated, then handed him the damaged letter with shaking hands. She watched his face as he read the fragments, saw his jaw tighten as he absorbed the implications. "Who are these children the letter mentions?" "My stepchildren, James and Emily. They're only 12 and 14, and they have no idea what their father was involved in. I raised them after their mother died, loved them as if they were my own." Her voice broke again. "I left them to keep them safe. As long as I stay away, as long as I don't testify about what I know, they'll be left alone. And if you do testify—" Margaret met his eyes directly. "Then everyone I care about dies, including them, including now, possibly you." Boone was quiet for a long moment, processing what she'd told him. Finally, he stood and moved to the window, looking out over his ranch with the expression of a man making a difficult decision. "The way I see it, Mrs. Ellsworth, you've got two choices. You can run again, keep running until they catch you or you die of exhaustion. Or you can stay here, help me figure out how to keep you safe, and maybe find a way to end this thing once and for all." Margaret stared at him in disbelief. "You don't understand what you're offering. These aren't common criminals. They have connections, money, influence. They won't hesitate to destroy you to get to me." Boone turned back to her, and she saw something in his expression that reminded her why this land had forged him into the man he was: an iron determination that wouldn't bend even under the weight of mortal danger. "Ma'am, I spent 4 years fighting in a war where good men died for principles they believed in. I've buried my wife, lost friends to violence and disease, and built a life in country that doesn't forgive weakness. I'm not about to be scared off by some city criminals who think they can terrorize a decent woman. He moved closer, his voice gentle but resolute. Besides, seems to me those children of yours need their mother back. Maybe it's time someone stood up to these people, showed them that not everyone can be intimidated. Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in months, mixed with the terrifying possibility of no longer being alone in her fight. But with that hope came the crushing weight of responsibility for what her presence might cost this good man. If you do this, if you help me, there's no going back. They'll come for you too. Boone's smile was grim but genuine. Then I guess we'd better be ready for them. In the days following Margaret's revelation, a subtle but profound change settled over the Double R Ranch. Boone found himself watching the horizon more carefully during his daily rides, and Margaret noticed how he'd positioned himself to have clear sightlines to the main road whenever they worked outside together. Neither spoke of the new tension, but both felt it like a low hum of electricity in the desert air. Margaret threw herself into her duties with an intensity that surprised everyone, including herself. She reorganized the kitchen with military precision, catalogued the ranch's supplies, and began keeping detailed records of daily operations that impressed even Miguel with their thoroughness. It was as if by making herself indispensable, she could somehow justify the danger her presence brought to these good people. On the fourth morning after her confession, Boone emerged from his room to find Margaret already dressed and working at the kitchen table, papers spread before her as she made careful notations in a leather-bound ledger. "You're up early again," he observed, accepting the cup of coffee she handed him without looking up from her work. "I've been reviewing your ranch records," Margaret said, finally raising her eyes to meet his. "I hope you don't mind, but I noticed some discrepancies in your accounts that could be costing you money." Boone set down his coffee cup and moved to look over her shoulder, immediately aware of her proximity, the faint scent of lavender soap, the careful precision of her handwriting, the way morning light caught the auburn highlights in her hair. He forced himself to focus on the numbers she was showing him. "See here," Margaret pointed to a column of figures. "Your feed costs have increased 30% over the past year, but your supplier hasn't adjusted for the bulk discount you should be receiving for orders over £500. And this shipment record shows you paid for premium grain that was delivered as standard grade." Boone studied the entries, impressed despite himself. "How did you catch this?" "I managed my late husband's business affairs for several years before his death. Numbers tell stories if you know how to read them." Margaret's expression grew more animated as she warmed to her subject. "Your ranch is profitable, Mr. Rawlins, but it could be much more so with better record-keeping and more aggressive negotiation with suppliers." "Call me Boone," he said quietly, "and thank you. I've been so focused on the day-to-day operations that I haven't paid enough attention to the business side." Something in his tone made Margaret look up from the ledger, and for a moment their eyes held with an intensity that had nothing to do with ranch finances. She was the first to look away, color rising in her cheeks as she returned to her calculations. "I'll speak with Miguel about renegotiating with the feed supplier," Boone said, his voice carefully neutral. "He handles most of our business relationships in town." "That's another thing I wanted to discuss with you." Margaret hesitated, then forged ahead. "Miguel is protective of you. I can see it in how he watches me. He's concerned about my presence here, isn't he?" Boone leaned against the kitchen counter, studying her thoughtful expression. "Miguel's been with me since Sarah died. He thinks I've gotten too comfortable being alone, and he's worried that—" He stopped, unsure how to finish the sentence. "That I'll hurt you somehow," Margaret completed quietly. "He's not wrong to be concerned. My presence here does put you at risk. That's not what he's worried about, and you know it." The words hung between them, acknowledging what neither had been willing to say directly, that whatever had begun as a practical arrangement was evolving into something more complicated. Margaret felt her heart rate quicken as she recognized the truth in his statement. Before she could respond, the sound of horses approaching interrupted the moment. Through the kitchen window, they could see Miguel and Tommy returning from their morning ride, but their expressions were tense, and they were riding faster than usual. Boone stepped outside to meet them, Margaret close behind. Miguel dismounted quickly, his weathered face showing concern. "Patron, we found tracks along the northern boundary. 3 riders, moving careful-like, staying in the wash where the ground's harder. Looks like they were watching the ranch." Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. "How recent?" "Yesterday, maybe the day before. Hard to tell for certain." Miguel's eyes moved between Boone and Margaret, understanding passing between the two men without words. Tommy, still mounted, shifted nervously in his saddle. "Should we ride out and try to follow the trail?" "No," Boone said firmly. "If someone's watching us, I don't want to let them know we've spotted them. Miguel, I want you to start varying our routine different times for checking the herds, different routes, and I want someone always within sight of the house." "Si, Patron. You want me to send word to Sheriff Willis?" Boone glanced at Margaret, who shook her head almost imperceptibly. "Not yet, but keep your rifles cleaned and ready." As the 2 ranch hands rode toward the barn, Margaret found herself trembling despite the morning warmth. "They've found me," she whispered. "I should leave immediately before." "You're not going anywhere," Boone said firmly, taking her arm to steady her. "Running didn't keep you safe before, and it won't now. Besides, if they're watching, leaving now would only confirm their suspicions. But if something happens to you, to Miguel and Tommy—" "Nothing's going to happen to anyone," Boone interrupted. "But I need to know more about what we're dealing with. These men who are after you, how many, what kind of resources do they have?" Margaret closed her eyes, forcing herself to think through her panic. "The organization my husband worked for has connections throughout the Northeast. They have money, influence, and they're not squeamish about violence. But they're also careful they can't afford to attract too much attention from federal authorities. So they'll try to handle this quietly. Yes, they'll want to eliminate me without creating a spectacle that might lead to investigations." Margaret's voice was steady now, her analytical mind taking over from her initial fear. "They'll probably try to make it look like an accident or a random crime." Boone nodded grimly. "Then we make sure they don't get the chance." The rest of the morning passed in an atmosphere of watchful tension. Margaret found herself glancing frequently toward the windows, while Boone made excuses to check on his men more often than usual. By afternoon, however, the rhythm of ranch work had reasserted itself, and some of the immediate fear had subsided. It was while hanging laundry behind the house that Margaret made her next discovery about her host. She was pinning one of Boone's shirts to the line when she noticed a wooden chest sitting in the shade of the back porch, its lid slightly ajar. Curious, she approached and carefully lifted the lid to reveal what was clearly a woman's apron. Sarah's apron, she realized, recognizing the careful embroidery and well-worn fabric. When Boone found her there a few minutes later, Margaret was holding the apron gently, her expression soft with understanding. "I should have put that away years ago," he said quietly. "It's beautiful work. She made this herself, didn't she?" Sarah was good with her hands, made most of her own clothes, did fancy needlework for the church bazaars. Boone's voice carried the weight of cherished memories. "She always said keeping busy was the secret to happiness out here." Margaret folded the apron carefully, then held it out to him. "You should keep it where you can see it. There's no shame in honoring someone you loved." But Boone shook his head, gently pushing the apron back toward her. "I think Sarah would want it to be useful again. Would you be willing to wear it? It seems wrong to let her work sit unused when there's someone here who could put it to good purpose." The request was simple, but Margaret understood its deeper significance. By offering her Sarah's apron, Boone was acknowledging her place in his household, accepting her presence as more than temporary. It was a gesture of trust and inclusion that moved her more than she could express. "I would be honored," she said simply, slipping the apron over her dress and tying the strings behind her waist. The fit was nearly perfect, as if Sarah had somehow made it for her. Boone watched the transformation with an expression that mixed grief and something that might have been hope. "It suits you," he said finally. That evening, as they sat on the front porch watching the sun set behind the mountains, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced since fleeing Boston, a sense of belonging. The dangers facing them hadn't diminished, and she knew the men hunting her would eventually close in. But for this moment, she allowed herself to imagine what it might be like to truly have a home again. "Tomorrow I want to teach you to shoot," Boone said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. Margaret turned to look at him in surprise. "I beg your pardon?" "If trouble comes, I want you able to defend yourself. Sarah never took to firearms, but you're going to learn." His tone brooked no argument. "This country doesn't forgive the unprepared, and neither do the kind of men who are hunting you." As if to underscore his point, a coyote's howl echoed across the desert, wild and lonely in the gathering darkness. Margaret shivered slightly, pulling Sarah's apron more tightly around herself, and nodded her agreement. Whatever came next, she would be ready for it. The nightmares returned with renewed intensity that night, leaving Margaret tossing restlessly in her bed as fragmented images of pursuit and violence played behind her closed eyelids. But it was what she whispered in her sleep that finally woke Boone in the room across the whole, desperate pleas spoken in the darkness. "Please don't hurt them," she murmured, her voice thick with distress. "They're just children. Take me instead, but leave the children alone." Boone lay in his own bed, listening to her unconscious anguish and feeling his protective instincts sharpen into something fierce and personal. Whatever demons haunted Margaret's sleep clearly involved more than her own safety, and the pain in her voice told him volumes about the sacrifices she'd already made. By morning, Margaret showed no sign of her restless night beyond the faint shadows under her eyes. She moved through her morning routine with practiced efficiency, but Boone noticed how her hands trembled slightly as she poured coffee, and how she startled when Tommy knocked on the kitchen door. "Ready for your shooting lesson?" Boone asked after breakfast, noting how she immediately straightened her shoulders at the reminder. "As ready as I can be, I suppose." They walked to a cleared area behind the barn where Boone had set up targets against a natural backstop of rocks. He'd brought several weapons: a rifle, a shotgun, and his personal sidearm, a well-maintained Colt revolver that had served him faithfully for years. "We'll start with basics," he said, demonstrating the proper stance and grip. "The key is staying calm and breathing steady. Panic makes you miss, and missing can get you killed." Margaret proved to be a surprisingly apt pupil. Her hands, accustomed to precise work from years of needlepoint and household management, adapted quickly to the feel of the weapons. More importantly, she showed no fear of the firearms themselves, only a healthy respect for their destructive potential. "You've done this before," Boone observed after watching her hit 3 consecutive targets with the rifle. "My father believed his daughters should be capable of defending themselves. He taught me to shoot when I was 16, though I haven't touched a gun in years." Margaret lowered the rifle, her expression thoughtful. "I never imagined I'd need those skills again." As they practiced, she found herself opening up about her past in ways that surprised them both. Perhaps it was the rhythm of loading and firing, or the necessity of trust that came with handling deadly weapons, but the words began flowing more freely than they had since her arrival. "My husband wasn't always involved with criminals," she said during a break between targets. "When I married him, he was a legitimate businessman, imports and shipping. But after his first wife died and he was left with 2 young children, he made some poor financial decisions. The debts accumulated, and eventually he accepted help from people who demanded payment in services rather than money." Boone cleaned his revolver while she spoke, his movements automatic as he focused on her words. "What kind of services?" "Moving money, mostly. Making legitimate transactions that would hide the source of funds that had been obtained through less legal means. Robert thought he could manage it, use their resources to rebuild his legitimate business, and then extract himself from the arrangement." Margaret's laugh held no humor. "He was naive about the kind of people he was dealing with. But you weren't. I grew up in Boston, I knew the stories about certain business associates, certain neighborhoods, where honest people didn't venture after dark. When Robert started coming home with expensive gifts he couldn't afford, when men with hard faces began visiting our house at odd hours, I knew we were in trouble. She picked up the Colt revolver, testing its weight in her hands. The weapon felt familiar despite the years since she'd last held one, and she found comfort in its solid presence. After Robert died, I discovered exactly how deep his involvement had gone. He'd kept detailed records insurance, he called it, though I think he was planning to use them as leverage to protect the children and me. Instead, those records became a death sentence. What did you do with them? Margaret met his eyes directly. I hid them where no one would think to look, and I made sure copies were placed with people who would know what to do if something happened to me. But the children, James and Emily, they had no idea what their father had been involved in. I couldn't let them pay for his mistakes. It was then that Boone made a discovery that explained much about Margaret's careful composure and hidden depths of pain. While helping her adjust her grip on the revolver, he noticed her glance toward her trunk, which sat in the shade of the barn. Following her gaze, he spotted something that had worked loose from the leather bindings, a small wooden horse, carved with the kind of loving detail that spoke of hours spent in patient craftsmanship. "That's a fine piece of work," he commented casually. Margaret's face went pale as she realized what he'd seen. For a moment, she seemed frozen between denial and explanation, but finally, she set down the gun and walked to the trunk. "Robert made this for James when the boy was 7, she said, lifting the wooden horse with hands that shook slightly. He was recovering from a broken leg and couldn't play outside, so Robert spent weeks carving this to keep him entertained. It was one of the few times I saw him put aside his business concerns to focus entirely on his son's happiness." Boone watched her cradle the toy, seeing in her expression the love of a mother for children she'd been forced to abandon. "You raised them as your own." From the time James was 6 and Emily was 4. Their mother had been my dearest friend. We grew up together, and when she was dying, she made me promise to care for them. I never had children of my own, so they became everything to me. Tears spilled down Margaret's cheeks as she spoke. Leaving them was the hardest thing I've ever done, but staying would have meant their deaths as well as mine. Where are they now? Safe, I hope. My attorney arranged for them to stay with my sister in Philadelphia, at least temporarily, but I know they don't understand why I left them. They must think I abandoned them by choice. The wooden horse slipped from her fingers as grief overwhelmed her composure. Boone caught it before it could hit the ground, then gently placed his hands on her shoulders. "They'll understand someday," he said quietly. "Children are more resilient than we give them credit for, and love doesn't disappear just because distance separates people. But what if I never see them again? What if the men hunting me find them despite all my precautions? Then we make sure that doesn't happen." Boone's voice carried a conviction that surprised them both with its intensity. "We find a way to end this threat permanently, so you can go back to those children where you belong." Margaret looked up at him through her tears, seeing something in his expression that went beyond mere compassion. In his brown eyes, she recognized the same fierce protectiveness she'd felt for James and Emily, the willingness to sacrifice everything for someone else's welfare. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you risk so much for someone you barely know?" Boone was quiet for a long moment, his hands still resting on her shoulders as he struggled to put his feelings into words. "Because I know what it's like to lose the people you love most," he said finally, "and because sometimes the only way to honor the dead is to protect the living." That evening, as they sat together on the porch again, Margaret found herself studying Boone's profile in the lamplight. She was beginning to understand that her arrival at the Double R had affected him as much as it had changed her own circumstances. The lonely widower who'd offered shelter to a stranded woman was discovering that caring for someone again meant accepting the possibility of loss all over again. "The children would like you," she said suddenly. Boone turned to look at her, surprised by the observation. "What makes you say that?" "James loves horses, and he's always been drawn to men who treat him as an equal rather than talking down to him. And Emily has been the practical one since her father died. She'd appreciate your straightforward manner." "Tell me about them," Boone said, settling back in his chair. "What are they like?" As Margaret began sharing stories of James's adventurous spirit and Emily's quick wit, Boone found himself imagining what it might be like to have children's laughter filling his house again. It was a dangerous thought, he knew, but one that grew stronger with every word Margaret spoke about the young people she'd loved and lost. Neither of them noticed Miguel watching from the barn, his weathered face thoughtful as he observed the growing connection between his patron and the mysterious woman who'd brought both hope and danger to the Double R. 2 months had passed since Margaret's arrival at the Double R, and the rhythms of ranch life had woven themselves around her presence with surprising naturalness. She'd proven herself invaluable not just as a housekeeper, but as a manager whose attention to detail had improved every aspect of the operation. The ledgers balanced perfectly, supplies arrived on schedule at better prices, and even the most stubborn ranch hands found themselves following her politely worded suggestions with something approaching enthusiasm. But it was the subtle changes in Boone himself that Miguel noticed most keenly as he watched his patron across the breakfast table on a crisp October morning. The deep lines of grief that had marked Boone's face for 3 years had softened, and there was a lightness to his step that had been absent since Sarah's death. More telling still was the way his eyes sought Margaret's throughout the day, and how conversations between them stretched longer each evening as they discovered new common ground. "The Hendersons are planning their harvest dance for next Saturday," Margaret mentioned as she refilled Boone's coffee cup, her tone carefully casual. "Mrs. Henderson stopped by yesterday to invite you. I told her I wasn't certain you'd want to attend." Boone looked up from the ranch account books they'd been reviewing together, noting the slight tension in her shoulders that suggested the invitation meant more to her than her casual tone implied. "Do you want to go?" "I haven't attended a social gathering in over 2 years, Margaret admitted. "I'd almost forgotten what it feels like to have that option." "Then we'll go." The decision seemed to surprise Boone as much as it did Margaret. "It's time folks in Dust Hollow got to know you properly, rather than just speculating about the mysterious woman staying at my ranch." Margaret's smile was radiant, but Boone caught the shadow of uncertainty that flickered across her features. He was learning to read these subtle signs of the fear that never entirely left her, the constant awareness that her past might reach out to destroy any happiness she dared to claim. "Are you certain it's wise? People will talk, and if the wrong person hears—" "Let them talk." Boone's voice carried a firmness that surprised them both. "I'm tired of tiptoeing around other people's opinions, and I'm tired of acting like we have something to be ashamed of." The declaration hung between them, loaded with implications neither was quite ready to examine directly. But later that morning, as Boone saddled his horse for the day's work, he found himself thinking about what it would mean to appear publicly with Margaret at his side. It would be a statement, one that would bind them together in the eyes of the community and make it impossible to maintain the fiction that theirs was merely a practical arrangement. He was still contemplating these implications when he noticed Margaret approaching the corral, carrying something wrapped in brown paper. She moved with the confidence that had developed over her weeks at the ranch, no longer the desperate woman who'd stepped off the train, but someone who'd found her place and purpose. "I have something for you," she said, offering him the package with an expression that mixed pleasure and nervousness. Inside the wrapping, Boone found a pocket watch not new, but beautifully maintained, with intricate engraving on its silver case. When he opened it, he discovered it had been fitted with a new chain of braided leather that matched his work clothes perfectly. "This was my father's," Margaret explained. "He carried it for 40 years, and after he died, I kept it as a reminder of his reliability and strength. I hoped you might find it useful." Boone turned the watch over in his hands, understanding the significance of the gift. This wasn't simply a useful item, it was a family heirloom, something precious that Margaret was entrusting to his care. More than that, it was a symbol of her growing confidence in their connection, her willingness to bind their lives together with shared possessions and mutual trust. "Margaret, I can't accept something this valuable." "You can and you will," she interrupted with mock sternness that made him smile. That watch needs to be carried by someone who values time and keeps his word. I can't think of anyone more suited to it than you." As he attached the watch chain to his vest, Boone felt the weight of more than just the timepiece. He was accepting not just a gift, but a declaration that acknowledged the depth of feeling that had grown between them, despite all the reasons they should have maintained their distance. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I'll treasure it." That afternoon brought visitors to the ranch, 3 men on horseback, who claimed to be looking for work, but whose eyes held the calculating hardness of professionals sizing up potential obstacles. Miguel spotted them first and rode quickly to alert Boone, who was mending fence near the eastern boundary. "Patron, strangers approaching the house. They don't look like cowboys." Boone dropped his tools and swung into his saddle, his mind immediately jumping to Margaret's safety. "How many?" 3, well-armed, riding good horses, the kind of men who know their business, whatever that business might be. By the time they reached the ranch house, the strangers had dismounted and were talking to Margaret on the front porch. Even from a distance, Boone could see the tension in her posture, the way she held herself ready to flee, while maintaining a facade of polite conversation. "Looking for work heading west," one of the men was saying as Boone approached. "Heard there might be opportunities in these parts." "I'm afraid we're fully staffed," Margaret replied, her voice steady despite the fear Boone could detect in her tone. "You might try the Morrison place, about 15 miles south." The stranger's smile was cold and calculating. "Funny thing, ma'am, we were told specifically to try here first. Someone in town mentioned you might have a particular interest in helping folks from back east." Boone dismounted carefully, his hand resting casually near his sidearm. "Something I can help you gentlemen with?" The leader of the group turned toward him with the lazy confidence of a predator assessing prey. "Just looking for honest work, friend. Your lady here was directing us elsewhere." "She's not my lady, she's Mrs. Ellsworth, and her directions are sound. We don't have positions available." Boone's tone was polite, but carried an unmistakable edge of warning. "Morrison's always looking for good men." "Ellsworth," the stranger repeated thoughtfully. "Interesting name. Reminds me of some folks I knew back in Boston. Small world, isn't it?" Margaret's face went white, but her voice remained steady. "I'm afraid you're mistaken. I've never been to Boston." "Course not," the man agreed with mock affability. "Must be thinking of someone else entirely. Well, we appreciate the directions. Maybe we'll see you folks around town." As the 3 men remounted and rode away, Boone moved to Margaret's side, feeling the tremors that ran through her body despite her outward composure. "Those weren't job seekers," she whispered. "I know." Boone's arm went around her shoulders, offering comfort and protection in equal measure. "But they're gone for now, and they didn't get what they came for. They know I'm here, Boone. That man, he knew my name, knew about Boston. It's only a matter of time before they come back with more men and fewer pretenses. Then we'd better be ready for them." Boone's jaw was set with grim determination. "Miguel, I want the rifles cleaned and loaded. And send Tommy to town, tell Sheriff Willis we need to talk." As they watched the dust cloud raised by the departing riders fade into the distance, Margaret leaned into Boone's strength and allowed herself a moment of gratitude for his steadfast presence. Whatever came next, she was no longer facing it alone. "The dance," she said suddenly. "We shouldn't go. If they're watching." "We're going," Boone said firmly. "I won't let fear dictate how we live our lives. Besides, if they're planning something, I'd rather have it happen where there are witnesses than out here where they can work unseen." Margaret nodded, understanding his logic, even as her heart raced with apprehension. The carefully constructed sanctuary of the Double R had been breached, and the life she'd begun to build here was now under direct threat. But looking into Boone's determined face, she felt a flicker of hope that perhaps, this time, she wouldn't have to run. The week leading up to the harvest dance passed in a state of heightened awareness that left everyone at the Double R on edge. Margaret threw herself into preparations with almost desperate intensity, as if by focusing on the mundane details of attending a social gathering, she could push aside the growing certainty that her hunters were closing in. She spent hours altering one of Sarah's dresses, a deep blue silk that had been carefully preserved in cedar, adjusting it to fit her slightly smaller frame, with the skill of someone who'd learned early that making do was often the only option. Boone watched her work with a mixture of admiration and concern, recognizing in her focused attention to detail the same coping mechanism he'd used after Sarah's death, the desperate need to control something, anything, when the larger forces shaping one's life felt overwhelming and unstoppable. "You don't have to do this," he said on Friday evening, finding her in the parlor with the dress spread across her lap as she made final adjustments to the hem. "If you've changed your mind about the dance—" "I haven't changed my mind." Margaret's voice carried a firmness that surprised them both. "I've spent 2 years running from shadows and living in fear. I refuse to let them take this from me too." But even as she spoke the brave words, Boone could see the tremor in her hands as she worked, and he made a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying in its implications. Moving to the small wooden chest where he kept his most precious possessions, Boone withdrew a small velvet box that hadn't been opened since Sarah's funeral. Inside lay her wedding ring, a simple gold band that had symbolized 15 years of partnership and love. For 3 years, he'd kept it as a talisman, unable to part with the physical reminder of what they'd shared. "Margaret," he said quietly, returning to sit beside her on the settee, "there's something I want you to have." When she saw the ring, Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She understood immediately what he was offering, not just a piece of jewelry, but a symbol of his commitment to her, his willingness to honor what had grown between them, despite all the obstacles and dangers. "Boone, I can't. This was Sarah's. It wouldn't be right." "Sarah's gone," he said gently, taking Margaret's left hand in his. "She's been gone for 3 years, and holding on to her ring won't bring her back. But you're here, and you're alive, and what we have together deserves to be acknowledged." With careful reverence, he slipped the ring onto Margaret's finger, where it settled as if it had always belonged there. The fit wasn't perfect. Sarah had been smaller boned, but it stayed in place, catching the lamplight with a warm glow that seemed to bless their union. "When we go to that dance tomorrow night," Boone continued, his voice rough with emotion, "I want everyone to know that you're not just my housekeeper or my guest. I want them to know that you're the woman I love, and that I'll stand with you against whatever comes." Margaret stared down at the ring through tears that blurred her vision, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was offering. In accepting this ring, she would be stepping fully into a new life, abandoning any pretense that her presence at the Double R was temporary or purely practical. "The men who are hunting me," she whispered, "if they realize how much you care, they'll use that against us. They'll hurt you to get to me. Let them try." Boone's voice carried the quiet steel that Margaret had come to associate with his most serious commitments. "I've buried one woman I loved. I won't lose another without a fight." That night, Margaret lay awake, staring at the ceiling, Sarah's ring heavy on her finger and her mind churning with possibilities, both wonderful and terrifying. Through the thin walls, she could hear Boone moving restlessly in his own room, and she knew he was struggling with the same mixture of hope and fear that kept her from sleep. Sometime near dawn, she made a decision that felt both liberating and final. Rising quietly, she retrieved her worn leather trunk, and with steady hands opened the hidden compartment that contained her most dangerous possessions. Among the letters and legal documents lay another Ringer wedding band, from her marriage to Robert Ellsworth, a heavy gold band set with diamonds that had represented security and respectability in Boston society. She held the 2 rings in her palms, weighing them not just physically but symbolically. Robert's ring represented a past that had brought her both love and, ultimately, mortal danger. Sarah's ring represented a future that was uncertain but filled with the promise of genuine partnership and protection. Walking to the window, Margaret opened the sash and looked out over the ranch that had become her sanctuary. In the pre-dawn darkness, she could make out the familiar shapes of the barn and corrals, the solid silhouette of the house that had sheltered her, and beyond it all, the vast expanse of desert that had taught her about endurance and the beauty that could flourish in harsh places. With deliberate ceremony, she removed Robert's ring from her finger for the last time. It had bound her to a life that was over, to obligations that had nearly destroyed her. Holding it up to catch the first rays of sunlight, she made her peace with the past and all its complicated legacy of love and betrayal. Then, with a motion that felt like cutting the last cord, tying her to her former life, she buried the ring beneath the rosebush that Sarah had planted beside the kitchen window, a garden that Margaret had tended with increasing affection as the seasons turned. Let it rest there, she thought, a memorial to choices made and prices paid, while she stepped forward into whatever future awaited her. When Boone found her there an hour later, kneeling beside the rosebush with dirt under her fingernails and peace in her expression, he didn't need to ask what she'd been doing. The absence of Robert's ring and the way Sarah's wedding band caught the morning light told him everything he needed to know about the choice she'd made. "No regrets?" he asked softly. "None," Margaret replied, rising to face him with a smile that transformed her entire countenance. "I'm exactly where I belong." They spent the morning in comfortable domesticity, sharing breakfast and the small intimacies of a couple who'd found their rhythm together. But as afternoon approached and the time for the dance drew near, both felt the weight of what they were about to do, present themselves publicly as partners, making a statement that would bind them together in the eyes of their community and, potentially, in the sights of those who wished them harm. As Margaret prepared for the evening, carefully arranging her hair and smoothing the blue silk dress that transformed her from a practical ranch woman into someone who could have graced any Boston ballroom, she felt a mixture of anticipation and trepidation that reminded her of being 16 and attending her first formal dance. But this was different. This wasn't about social expectations or making a good impression on potential suitors. This was about claiming her right to happiness, to love, to a future that she would build with her own hands alongside a man who'd proven his worth through actions rather than words. When she emerged from her room, Boone was waiting in the parlor, dressed in his best suit, with his hair freshly trimmed and his boots polished to a shine. The sight of him, handsome, dignified, and clearly as nervous as she was made, her heart skipped in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the delicious anticipation of being courted by a man she'd come to love. "You look beautiful," he said simply, offering her his arm with the formal courtesy of a man escorting his lady to an important social function. "So do you," Margaret replied, meaning it completely. As they drove toward town in Boone's best wagon, both dressed in their finest clothes and wearing their hearts on their sleeves, neither spoke of the danger that might be waiting for them. Tonight was about claiming their happiness, about refusing to let fear dictate the boundaries of their lives. Tomorrow would bring whatever challenges it held, but tonight was theirs. The Henderson barn had been transformed for the harvest dance, with lanterns strung from the rafters and tables laden with the bounty of the season. The entire community of Dust Hollow had turned out for the event, from elderly ranchers who remembered when the territory was still wild Apache country to young families just starting their lives together in this harsh but rewarding land. Margaret felt every eye in the room turn toward them as she entered on Boone's arm, and she was grateful for his steady presence beside her. The blue silk dress rustled softly as they walked, and Sarah's ring caught the lantern light like a beacon announcing her new status to anyone observant enough to notice. "Boone Rawlins, as I live and breathe." Mrs. Henderson bustled over, her round face beaming with pleasure and curiosity. "And this must be the mysterious Mrs. Ellsworth we've all been hearing about. Margaret, I'd like you to meet Clara Henderson. Clara, this is Margaret Ellsworth, and I'd appreciate it if you'd help her feel welcome tonight." Clara's shrewd eyes took in every detail, the quality of Margaret's dress, the way she carried herself, and most importantly, the wedding ring that marked her as more than just Boone's housekeeper. "Well, of course, dear. Any friend of Boone's is family to us. Now come along, let me introduce you to the other ladies." As the evening progressed, Margaret found herself genuinely enjoying the company and conversation. The women of Dust Hollow were a hardy, practical bunch who appreciated her education and refinement without being intimidated by it. They shared stories of frontier life, exchanged recipes, and offered the kind of casual friendship that Margaret had missed desperately during her months of isolation and fear. But it was when she danced with Boone that the evening truly became magical. He was a surprisingly graceful partner, moving with the confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin, and as they swept across the makeshift dance floor, Margaret felt years of tension and fear melt away. For these precious moments, she was simply a woman in love, dancing with the man who'd captured her heart. "You're full of surprises, Mr. Rawlins," she murmured as he spun her expertly through a waltz. "Where did a cattle rancher learn to dance like this?" "Sarah loved to dance," he replied, his voice warm with memory rather than pain. "We used to clear out the parlor once a month and dance to her music box until midnight. She said it kept the romance alive in a marriage." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes at the generosity of spirit that allowed him to share such intimate memories without jealousy or reservation. "She sounds like a wise woman." She was, and I think she'd approve of you. They were so absorbed in each other that neither noticed the stranger who'd entered the barn until he was standing directly beside them. Margaret felt Boone stiffen before she saw the mantle, weathered, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority and the sharp eyes of a professional observer. "Excuse me," the stranger said politely, though something in his tone made several nearby couples stop dancing to listen. "I'm looking for a Mrs. Margaret Ellsworth. I was told I might find her here." Margaret's blood turned to ice, but before she could respond, Boone stepped slightly in front of her, his body language shifting from relaxed enjoyment to protective alertness. "Who's asking?" Boone's voice carried the quiet menace of a man prepared to defend what was his. The stranger reached into his jacket, causing several men in the room to tense, but what he withdrew was a leather badge case rather than a weapon. "Detective Patrick O'Malley, Boston Police Department. Mrs. Ellsworth, I need to speak with you urgently." The barn fell silent, except for the scraping of nervous feet and the rustle of fabric as people shifted to get a better view of the unfolding drama. Margaret felt the weight of dozens of curious and concerned gazes, but her attention was focused entirely on the badge in O'Malley's weathered hands. "I'm Mrs. Ellsworth," she said quietly, proud that her voice remained steady, despite the terror coursing through her veins. "What do you want with me?" "Ma'am, I need you to know that I'm not here to arrest you or cause you harm. In fact, I'm here because your life is in immediate danger, and I believe you have information that could save not only yourself but several other innocent people." Boone moved closer to Margaret, his hand resting on her waist in a gesture that was both protective and possessive. "Maybe we should take this conversation somewhere more private." O'Malley nodded gratefully. "That would be advisable. What I have to say concerns matters that certain people have killed to keep secret." They moved to a small storage room behind the main barn, followed by several of the local men, including Sheriff Willis, who'd been enjoying the dance until this unwelcome interruption. Margaret's mind raced as she tried to process this unexpected development. A Boston detective seeking her out could mean only one thing. The careful wall of secrecy she'd built around her new life was about to come crashing down. "Mrs. Ellsworth," O'Malley began once they had privacy, "how much do you know about your late husband's business associates?" "Enough to know that they're dangerous and that they want me dead," Margaret replied with bitter honesty. "Beyond that, I've tried not to think about it." "Well, you need to start thinking about it now, because the situation has changed dramatically since you left Boston." O'Malley's expression was grim. "We've been investigating Senator Harrison Blackwood for the past year, following a trail of corruption and money laundering that stretches from Boston to Washington, D.C. Margaret felt the floor seem to shift beneath her feet. Senator Blackwood was one of the most powerful men in Massachusetts, a political figure whose influence reached into every level of government and business. "Your husband kept very detailed records of his transactions with Blackwood's organization," O'Malley continued. "Records that document not just money laundering, but election fraud, bribery, and at least 3 murders ordered to protect the senator's interests." "I don't understand," Margaret whispered. Robert told me he was working with shipping concerns, men who needed help moving money discreetly but legally. Ma'am, your husband was laundering money for one of the most corrupt political machines in the country. Senator Blackwood has been using his position to facilitate criminal enterprises for over a decade, and your husband's records are the key to proving it. Boone's hand tightened on Margaret's waist as he processed the implications. Are you saying that Margaret has evidence that could bring down a U.S. senator? That's exactly what I'm saying, and that's why Blackwood's men have been hunting her so relentlessly. It's not just about revenge or silencing a witness, it's about destroying evidence that could end his career and send him to prison for the rest of his life. Margaret sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was hearing. The children, James and Emily, are they safe? For now. But that could change quickly if Blackwood realizes you're still alive and still have access to those records. O'Malley leaned forward intently. Mrs. Ellsworth, I need to ask you directly, you still have your husband's business papers? Margaret looked at Boone, seeing in his eyes the same question that was tearing at her heart. She could lie, claim the papers were lost or destroyed, and possibly escape this nightmare by maintaining her silence. But doing so would leave Blackwood free to continue his criminal activities and would mean that other innocent people would suffer and die. Yes, she said quietly. I have them. Where? Margaret hesitated, then made the decision that would change everything. Hidden in my trunk at the Double R Ranch. But Detective O'Malley, you need to understand the moment I reveal those papers, everyone I care about becomes a target. The children, Mr. Rawlins, his ranch, Hans everyone. Ma'am, I won't lie to you, there is risk involved, but Blackwood's people are already closing in. 3 of his hired killers arrived in Dust Hollow yesterday, and they're not here to negotiate. Your choices are to run again and hope they don't catch you, or to help us end this once and for all. Boone spoke for the first time since the conversation began, his voice carrying absolute conviction. What do you need from us? O'Malley smiled grimly. I need Mrs. Ellsworth to testify before a federal grand jury, and I need those business records as evidence. In exchange, I can offer federal protection for her and anyone else Blackwood might target in retaliation. The children will be reunited with you once Blackwood is in custody and his organization is dismantled. Margaret closed her eyes, weighing the terrible choice before her. She could continue running, continue living in fear and separation from the children she loved, or she could stand and fight with the knowledge that doing so might cost the lives of everyone she'd come to care about. When she opened her eyes, her decision was written clearly in her expression. Detective O'Malley, she said steadily, I'll give you everything you need to destroy Harrison Blackwood. But I want your word that if something happens to me, those children will be protected. You have it, Mom, but nothing's going to happen to you if I can help it. As they prepared to leave the barn and return to the ranch where Margaret's dangerous secrets waited, none of them noticed the figure watching from the shadows outside one of Blackwood's men, who'd been positioned to observe the dance and report on any unusual activity. The game had changed, and time was running out faster than any of them realized. The ride back to the Double R took place in tense silence, with Detective O'Malley following Boone's wagon on a borrowed horse while scanning the darkness for signs of the danger he knew was closing in around them. Margaret sat rigidly beside Boone, her hands clenched in her lap as she grappled with the magnitude of what she'd committed herself to. There would be no going back now by morning. She would either be under federal protection or dead. It wasn't until they were safely inside the ranch house with the doors locked and curtains drawn that Margaret allowed herself to examine the full implications of what lay ahead. As she moved toward her trunk to retrieve the hidden documents, her legs felt unsteady and she had to grip the furniture for support. Are you all right? Boone asked, immediately at her side, with the protective concern she'd come to depend on. Just frightened, Margaret admitted, grateful for his steadying presence. I've been running from this moment for so long that actually facing it feels surreal. While Margaret worked to open the trunk's secret compartment, O'Malley examined the ranch house with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to assessing defensive positions. The adobe construction would stop most bullets. The windows provided good sightlines in multiple directions, and the building's position on slightly elevated ground offered tactical advantages. "How many men work here?" O'Malley asked Boone. "Two full-time hands, Miguel and Tommy. Both good men, handy with firearms, and loyal to the brand. We'll need them. Blackwood's people won't announce themselves when they come calling." Margaret finally succeeded in opening the hidden compartment, revealing a collection of papers and ledgers that had been carefully preserved despite her long journey west. As she lifted them out, her hands trembled slightly at the weight of what they represented, not just evidence of criminal activity, but the key to either her salvation or her destruction. "These are Robert's business records going back 5 years, she explained, spreading the documents across the kitchen table. "Every transaction, every meeting, every payment, documented everything, obsessively." O'Malley began examining the papers with the focused intensity of a man who'd spent years building cases against dangerous criminals. What he found exceeded even his expectations. "My God," he breathed, holding up a particular ledger. "This documents over $2 million in laundered money, complete with dates, amounts, and destination accounts. And look at this." He pointed to a series of entries marked with Blackwood's initials. "Your husband was keeping track of bribes paid to federal judges, customs officials, even members of Congress." "Robert was paranoid about being betrayed," Margaret explained. "He said that in his line of work, information was the only insurance policy that mattered." He was right. This is enough evidence to bring down not just Blackwood, but his entire network. O'Malley's satisfaction was evident, but it was tempered by the reality of their situation. "The problem is, Blackwood knows you have this. He's not going to wait for us to get you safely to Boston to testify." As if summoned by his words, Miguel appeared at the kitchen door, his face grim with news that confirmed their worst fears. "Patron, we have visitors. 3 men on horseback, moving careful, like toward the ranch. They're not trying to hide, but they're not announcing themselves either." Boone was already reaching for his rifle. "The same 3 from yesterday. See, and they brought friends. I count at least 6 riders now, maybe more." O'Malley cursed under his breath. "They're not here to negotiate. Mrs. Ellsworth, is there another way out of this house?" "There's a root cellar with an outside entrance," Boone replied, his mind already shifting to tactical considerations. "But if they've surrounded the place, running won't help." It was then that Margaret made a discovery that changed everything about how she viewed the man she'd fallen in love with. Moving toward his bedroom to gather additional ammunition, Boone opened a wooden chest that Margaret had never seen him access before. Inside, carefully preserved in oiled cloth, lay the uniform and medals of a Union cavalry officer. "You were in the war," she said, not really a question, but a statement of sudden understanding. "Captain, 3rd Colorado Cavalry," Boone replied tersely, checking the action on a Spencer-repeating rifle that showed the wear of hard use. "I served under Colonel Chivington during the Indian campaigns, then got transferred east for the final push against Richmond." O'Malley looked up from the documents with new respect. "Cavalry officer, that explains why you're not panicking at the prospect of being outnumbered." 6 men isn't outnumbered," Boone said with grim humor. "It's just good odds for the other side." As if to prove his point, he began issuing orders with the calm authority of someone accustomed to command under pressure. "Miguel, I want you and Tommy to take positions in the barn with clear fields of fire toward the main approach. Detective, can you handle a Winchester?" "I can manage." "Good. You'll take the parlor window. It covers the north side of the house. Margaret," he turned to her with an expression that mixed love and determination, "I know you can shoot. Sarah's rifle is in the bedroom closet, already loaded. Take the kitchen window that faces east." Margaret felt a moment of almost hysterical amusement at the domestic nature of the instruction Sarah's rifle, as if she were being asked to use her predecessor's sewing basket. But she nodded, understanding that Boone's military experience might be the only thing standing between them and certain death. "What about the documents?" O'Malley asked, carefully gathering the papers that represented months of investigation and the key to justice. Leave them spread out, Boone decided. If something happens to us, maybe whoever finds them will understand their importance. Outside, they could hear the sound of horses moving closer, accompanied by the low murmur of men's voices coordinating their approach. Margaret moved to her assigned position, checking the rifle's load and trying to remember everything Boone had taught her about shooting under pressure. Through the kitchen window, she could see shadowy figures moving between the outbuildings, professional in their movements, and clearly experienced in this kind of work. These weren't desperate criminals or common thugs, they were killers, probably ex-soldiers themselves, hired specifically for their competence and ruthlessness. "Mrs. Ellsworth," a voice called from the darkness. "We know you're in there. This doesn't have to end badly for everyone. Just come out with the papers, and we'll make this quick and painless." Boone's answering shout carried the authority of command. "You're trespassing on private property. Clear out now, and nobody has to get hurt." Harsh laughter greeted this declaration. "There's 6 of us and 3 of you, old man. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." "Actually," O'Malley called out, unable to resist correcting them, "there's 4 of us. Detective Patrick O'Malley, Boston Police. You boys are under arrest for conspiracy, murder, and attempting to intimidate a federal witness." The response was immediate, and violent muzzle flashes erupted from multiple positions around the ranch, and bullets began thudding into the adobe walls and splintering the wooden window frames. Margaret ducked instinctively as glass exploded above her head, then forced herself to return fire at the shadowy figures she could see moving near the barn. The battle had begun in earnest, and Margaret realized with crystal clarity that this was the moment everything would be decided. Either they would survive the night, and she would finally be free to reclaim her life and her children, or the documents scattered across the kitchen table would become evidence in a murder investigation rather than a corruption trial. But as she watched Boone move with practiced efficiency from window to window, laying down precise covering fire while coordinating with Miguel and Tommy by whistle signals that spoke of shared military experience, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced since fleeing Boston confidence in ultimate victory. These men might be professional killers, but they were facing a combat veteran who'd spent years learning how to win against superior numbers. And more than that, they were facing people who had something worth fighting for: love, justice, and the chance to build a future free from fear. The rifle bucked against Margaret's shoulder. She fired at a figure attempting to flank their position, and she felt a fierce satisfaction when the man stumbled and retreated. She might be a Boston society woman, but she was also a frontier rancher's partner now, and she would not go down without a fight. Outside, she could hear Blackwood's men regrouping, probably realizing that their intended victims were going to be more difficult to eliminate than expected. But Margaret knew this was just the beginning of what would be a long and deadly night. As dawn approached, one way or another, the threat that had haunted her for months would finally be resolved. Either justice would triumph, or she would die, knowing that she'd stood her ground rather than running again. Either way, she was no longer afraid. The gunfight that erupted around the Double R ranch house was unlike anything Margaret had ever imagined, even in her darkest nightmares about the men pursuing her. The darkness exploded with muzzle flashes and the sharp crack of rifle fire, while bullets whined overhead and thudded into the thick adobe walls that were all that stood between them and certain death. Boone moved through the house with the fluid efficiency of a man who'd learned combat in the crucible of war, appearing at different windows to return fire before shifting position to avoid giving their attackers a fixed target. His military training was evident in every movement: the way he conserved ammunition, the precise timing of his shots, and the calm authority with which he coordinated their defense through whistle signals that Miguel and Tommy understood instantly. From her position at the kitchen window, Margaret could see 2 of Blackwood's men attempting to work their way closer to the house using the cover of the corrals. Sarah's rifle felt solid and familiar in her hands now, no longer the foreign instrument of violence it had seemed during her first shooting lessons, but a tool of survival and justice. She drew a careful bead on the nearer figure, exhaled slowly as Boone had taught her, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle's report was lost in the general cacophony of gunfire, but she saw the man stumble and fall back, clutching his shoulder as he sought better cover. "Good shot!" O'Malley called from his position in the parlor, where he was methodically returning fire with the disciplined accuracy of a professional lawman. "Keep them pinned down while I try to get a better angle on the ones by the barn." The attackers were good better than the common criminals Margaret had feared they might be. These were professionals, probably ex-soldiers themselves, who understood tactics and weren't making the mistake of rushing a defended position. Instead, they were trying to wear down the defenders with sustained fire while working to surround the house and eliminate any possibility of escape. But they had made one crucial miscalculation. They had underestimated both Boone's military experience and the fierce determination of people fighting for everything they held dear. Miguel's voice rang out from the barn, clear and defiant, despite the bullets whining around him. "Vayanse, this is our land, and we will defend it." His words were punctuated by the deeper boom of a shotgun, followed by a scream of pain from somewhere in the darkness. Tommy's higher voice joined in, whooping with the enthusiasm of youth as he discovered that the shooting skills he'd developed hunting rabbits served him well in more serious circumstances. Margaret was reloading Sarah's rifle when she heard a sound that made her blood run cold, the soft scrape of someone climbing onto the roof above the kitchen. One of Blackwood's men had managed to get close enough to the house to attempt a direct assault from above. "Boone!" she called urgently. "Someone's on the roof!" His response was immediate and decisive. Moving to a position beneath where the sounds were coming from, he fired 3 quick shots upward, through the wooden ceiling. The sounds of movement stopped abruptly, followed by the thud of a body rolling off the roof and hitting the ground outside. "Adobe stops bullets," Boone said grimly, working the lever of his rifle to chamber another round. "Wood doesn't, remember that." But even as they celebrated this small victory, Margaret could see that their situation was becoming increasingly desperate. They were holding their own for now, but ammunition wouldn't last forever, and the attackers were gradually tightening their circle around the ranch house. It was then that Margaret heard something that made her heart leap with hope, the sound of additional horses approaching at a gallop, accompanied by voices she didn't recognize, but that carried the authority of law enforcement. "Federal Marshals!" someone shouted from the darkness. "This is Deputy Marshal Crawford. Cease firing immediately." The gunshots slowed, then stopped entirely as both sides tried to assess this new development. Through her window, Margaret could see riders with badges gleaming in the moonlight, surrounding the ranch with the practiced efficiency of men accustomed to such operations. O'Malley lowered his rifle and called out, "Detective O'Malley, Boston Police. I've got a federal witness in here, and we're under attack by hired killers." "We can see that, Detective," came the reply. "Blackwood's men, drop your weapons and surrender. You're surrounded and outnumbered." For a moment, it seemed as if the siege might end without further bloodshed. Then one of Blackwood's men, perhaps panicked by the arrival of federal law enforcement, made a desperate break for freedom. The man burst from cover near the barn, firing wildly as he ran toward where he'd left his horse. His shots went wide, but they triggered a response from both the marshals and the defenders of the ranch house. Margaret watched in horrified fascination as Sarah's rifle bucked in her hands, her shot joining the volley that brought the fleeing killer down just yards from where his horse waited. He fell hard and didn't move again, his weapon spinning away into the darkness. In the sudden silence that followed, Margaret realized she had just killed a man taken, a human life, in defense of her own and the people she loved. The knowledge hit her like a physical blow, leaving her gasping and shaking as the reality of what she'd done sank in. But there was no time for reflection or regret. Even with the arrival of federal marshals, the night's work was far from over. The remaining attackers, realizing their situation had become hopeless with the arrival of federal marshals, began surrendering one by one. But just as Margaret dared to hope the nightmare was finally over, the sound of a single horse approaching at a hard gallop cut through the desert silence. The rider who emerged from the darkness was not another hired killer, but a man whose very presence radiated authority and barely controlled rage. Even in the moonlight, Margaret recognized him from newspaper photographs, Senator Harrison Blackwood himself, come to personally oversee the elimination of the woman who threatened to destroy his empire. "This ends now," Blackwood shouted, his cultured Boston accent seeming grotesquely out of place in the Arizona desert. "Mrs. Ellsworth, I know you're in there. You have something that belongs to me, and I want it back." Deputy Marshal Crawford spurred his horse forward, hand resting on his sidearm. "Senator, you're under arrest for conspiracy, murder, and intimidation of a federal witness. Dismount immediately and surrender your weapons." Blackwood's laugh was harsh and bitter. "Marshal, you have no idea what you're interfering with. I have connections that reach all the way to Washington. By morning, your badge will be worthless and your career will be over." "Maybe so," Crawford replied evenly. "But right now, you're on my warrant and you're going to jail." It was then that Margaret made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. Rising from her position by the kitchen window, she walked to the front door and stepped out onto the porch, Sarah's rifle still in her hands, but lowered in a gesture of temporary peace. "Senator Blackwood," she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the ranch yard. "You want your property back? Then let's discuss this directly, without hiding behind hired killers and threats." Boone immediately appeared beside her, his own rifle ready, while O'Malley took position on her other side. Together, the three of them faced the man whose corruption had destroyed so many lives and driven Margaret into years of fearful exile. "Mrs. Ellsworth," Blackwood said, attempting to regain his composure and political charm, "you've caused me considerable inconvenience. All I want is the return of certain business documents that were taken without authorization. Surely we can reach an accommodation that benefits everyone." "You mean the documents that prove you've been laundering money for criminals, bribing federal officials, and ordering murders to protect your interests?" Margaret's voice was steady, but her grip on the rifle tightened. "Those documents? I mean private business correspondence that has been grossly misinterpreted by people who don't understand the complexities of legitimate financial transactions." O'Malley stepped forward, his badge gleaming in the moonlight. "Senator, we have your business records, your correspondence, and testimony from witnesses who can place you at meetings where criminal activities were planned. Your only choice now is whether you surrender peacefully or we take you by force." For a moment, Blackwood seemed to deflate, the weight of his exposed crimes finally crushing his arrogant confidence. But then his hand moved toward the weapon at his side, and Margaret realized with crystalline clarity that he had no intention of surrendering. "If I'm going down," he snarled, "I'm taking the bitch who destroyed me with me." The next few seconds unfolded with the terrible slow-motion clarity that comes in moments of mortal danger. Blackwood's hand closed on his pistol grip just as Margaret raised Sarah's rifle to her shoulder. Boone was moving to shield her with his own body, while O'Malley drew his service weapon with practiced speed. Margaret's shot came first, the rifle bucking against her shoulder as the bullet took Blackwood high in the chest, spinning him out of his saddle to land hard in the ranch yard dust. His own shot went wild, the bullet whining harmlessly into the darkness as his strength failed him. As federal marshals rushed to secure the fallen senator, Margaret stood frozen on the porch, staring at what she had done. This was no nameless hired killer she had brought down in the heat of battle, but one of the most powerful men in Massachusetts, a United States senator who had wielded influence over the lives of millions. "Is he dead?" she whispered. Deputy Marshal Crawford knelt beside Blackwood, checking for signs of life. "No, ma'am. Wounded badly, but he'll live to stand trial. Which is more than he deserves, considering what he's done." Boone's arm went around Margaret's shoulders, offering the comfort and support she desperately needed. "It's over," he said quietly. "Finally, it's really over." O'Malley was already gathering the scattered documents from the kitchen table, handling them with the reverence due to evidence that would reshape American politics and send dozens of corrupt officials to prison. "Mrs. Ellsworth," he said formally, "I need to inform you that you'll be required to testify before a federal grand jury, but under full government protection. And I have authorization to tell you that your stepchildren are safe and will be brought to Arizona as soon as it's secure." Margaret sagged against Boone's strength, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just occurred. The nightmare that had driven her across a continent was finally over. Justice would be served, the children she loved would be returned to her, and she could begin building the future she'd barely dared to dream of. As dawn broke over the desert, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Margaret Ellsworth stood on the porch of the Double R Ranch and watched federal marshals loading the last of Blackwood's criminal organization into wagons for transport to trial. She was free at last. 3 months later, Margaret stood once again on the platform of the Dust Hollow train station, but this time her heart was filled with anticipation rather than desperation. The morning sun cast the same golden light across the weathered boards, but everything else had changed. She was no longer a fugitive seeking sanctuary, but a woman preparing to welcome her family home. The federal grand jury proceedings in Boston had lasted 6 weeks, during which Margaret's testimony had helped secure indictments against not only Senator Blackwood, but 37 other individuals involved in his criminal network. The newspapers had called it the largest corruption scandal in decades, with ramifications that reached into the highest levels of government and business. Throughout the trial, Boone had remained at her side, his steady presence providing the strength she needed to face the men who had terrorized her for so long. When federal prosecutors offered her immunity in exchange for her cooperation, it was Boone who helped her understand that justice served was worth any personal risk. Now, as the train's whistle echoed across the desert, announcing the arrival that would complete her transformation from exile to homecoming, Margaret felt her hands trembling with an emotion she'd almost forgotten: pure, uncomplicated joy. The locomotive wheezed to a stop in a cloud of steam and dust, and from one of the passenger cars emerged 2 figures that made Margaret's heart leap with recognition. James, now 13 and taller than she remembered, stepped down first, with the careful dignity of a young man trying to act older than his years. Behind him came Emily, 15 now, and possessing the grave beauty of someone who'd grown up too quickly in her stepmother's absence. For a moment, the 3 of them simply stared at each other across the platform, 2 years of separation and uncertainty stretching between them like an invisible gulf. Then Emily broke into a run, her careful composure dissolving as she launched herself into Margaret's arms with a sob of relief and happiness. "Mama!" she cried, using the name she'd called Margaret since childhood. "We thought we'd never see you again." James followed more slowly, but his embrace was no less fierce when he finally reached them. Margaret held both children close, breathing in their familiar scents and feeling the solid reality of their presence after so many months of fearing she might never hold them again. "I'm so sorry," she whispered against their hair. "I'm so sorry I had to leave you, but I couldn't let them hurt you. I couldn't." "We know," James said quietly, his voice deeper than she remembered. "Uncle Patrick explained everything after the trial. We know you left to protect us." Detective O'Malley. Uncle Patrick to the children had indeed become a family friend during the long months of legal proceedings. He emerged from the train car now, carrying the children's luggage and wearing the satisfied expression of a man who'd seen justice properly served. "Mrs. Rawlins," he said with a grin, using Margaret's new married name with obvious pleasure, "I believe these belong to you." The wedding had taken place 2 weeks earlier in the small church in Dust Hollow, with the entire community in attendance to celebrate the union of 2 people who'd found love in the most unlikely circumstances. Margaret wore a dress of ivory silk that she'd made herself, while Boone stood at the altar in his best suit, his eyes shining with happiness as he slipped a new wedding ring onto her finger. They'd chosen together to symbolize their fresh beginning. Now, as she introduced her children to their new stepfather, Margaret watched with wonder as the family she'd dreamed of began to take shape before her eyes. Boone's natural ease with young people and his genuine interest in their experiences quickly broke down any awkwardness, while the children responded to his straightforward manner and obvious devotion to their stepmother. "Can we see the ranch?" Emily asked eagerly, her eyes bright with curiosity about this new life they were inheriting. Mama wrote about the horses and the wide-open spaces, but it's hard to imagine after living in Philadelphia. "Course you can," Boone replied, lifting their luggage as if it weighed nothing. "Got a couple of gentle mares that'll be perfect for teaching you to ride proper, and Miguel's been looking forward to having young folks around the place again." The ranch house had been transformed in preparation for the children's arrival. What had once been guest rooms were now personalized, spaces filled with books, toys, and the kind of comfortable furnishings that spoke of permanence and belonging. Margaret had spent weeks preparing, wanting everything to be perfect for the homecoming she'd never dared hope would happen. That evening, as they sat around the dinner table, a real family at last, Margaret looked at the faces illuminated by lamplight and felt a contentment she'd never known was possible. James was telling Boone about his interest in engineering, while Emily peppered Margaret with questions about ranch life and her plans for expanding the house's library. Later, after the children had been settled in their new rooms and the house had grown quiet, Margaret and Boone sat together on the front porch, watching the stars emerge in the vast desert sky. She wore Sarah's apron still, though it was now truly hers, just as this life was truly hers. "Any regrets?" Boone asked softly, his arm around her shoulders as they rocked gently in the wooden chairs he'd built for their evenings together. "None," Margaret replied, meaning it completely. "Sometimes the worst things that happen to us lead to the best things we never knew we wanted." In the distance, a coyote howled its lonely song to the moon, but the sound no longer made Margaret shiver with fear. This was her home now, these were her people, and she'd fought for the right to claim them all. The broken promises that had brought her to Dust Hollow had indeed led her right to love, right to family, right to the kind of happiness that comes only to those brave enough to stand and fight for it when everything seems lost. As she settled deeper into Boone's embrace, Margaret smiled at the irony that had shaped her life. She'd come west as a refugee seeking sanctuary, but she'd found something infinitely more valuable. She'd found herself, and in doing so, she'd found her way home.